So let's talk about the Sermon on the Mount. It is one of the longer passages in the New Testament of just Jesus teaching, uninterrupted. If you've got a red letter Bible, it's 3 solid chapters in all red. This is the sort of text that I encourage students, friends, people, to memorize texts, to memorize not just verses of the Bible, but passages of the Bible. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I've got my kids memorizing verses. We listen to little songs that have memory verses. And I was talking to them this morning at breakfast because Matthew 7:12 is one of their memory verses. If they were a little more self-controlled, I would have them come in and recite it for you, but they're not very self-controlled. But it says, in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law of the prophets, the golden rule, right? And that's great for kids and for young people and new Christians. Memorizing a verse and then like the chapter and verse for it is great. As adult believers, as believers who have been in this for a minute, we should be moving toward memorizing passages, memorizing a whole paragraph, memorizing a whole chapter. There's really nothing to stop you from memorizing the whole Sermon on the Mount. And this is the sort of text that would be worthwhile to memorize. There's a lot of text like that where the whole passage, the whole thing buried in your heart is worthwhile. As opposed to like the disparate, meaningful verses. Everybody knows Romans 3:23, but Romans 3:23 means a lot when you have Romans 3 memorized. And it's the same thing here with the Sermon on the Mount. We know the Lord's Prayer, but having the Lord's Prayer in the context of the rest of the sermon gives it additional meaning when you're apart from the text, when you don't have it in front of you, but you know the text. It will help you when it is readily springing to mind. Good on this? I went to I think it was my grandparents' church, so this would have been 20 years ago. The pastor got up one morning. I think they were doing a series on Matthew or a series on the Sermon on the Mount or something. He got up, like after the worship music and everything, he put a stool down and he sat down on the stool and he recited from memory the entire Sermon on the Mount. And then he got up and he was done with the sermon. Like that was his message for the day, was just reciting the Sermon on the Mount and then leaving. I really liked that because he didn't feel the need that most of us feel to like interpret and give our own spicy take on the words we see in the Bible, right? He kind of just read it because it can speak for itself and moved on. I really appreciated that. The Sermon on the Mount has some of the most famous sections in it that a lot of us are used to, a lot of us are very familiar with. So we're going to get into this, and some of them I'm probably going to suggest, alternative ways of reading it that might not be what you're used to or what we've heard in sermons before. And some of it might be very much what we're used to and what we've heard in sermons before. Okay, so it could be hit or miss. And then, as always, questions or comments or whatever thoughts that you all might have, feel free to raise your hand and we'll talk about it and interact and move forward. Okay, so let's get started. Actually, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to put this up first. I think this is from my supervising professor at Southern. He wrote a book called The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing. I've got it right here. Look at that. So the podcast that I sent you all, he did the Sermon on the Mount episode with the podcast, and it was based on his work in this book. I'm pretty sure this image that I pulled, I found it online, but I'm pretty sure it's from this book somewhere. The reason that I put it up in front of you is because scholars like to talk about the way that the text is broken down. Matthew's gospel as a whole is very well structured. It seems very intentional the way that it's designed. This is what we talked about on Tuesday and in the video last week about the 5 major discourses and the way that it's designed and all this sort of stuff. We think the Sermon on the Mount is also heavily, heavily designed. Like, it's not just that he came up with great ideas to put together. It's that the way that it's structured is essentially like concentric threes. So there's three large sections. I think it's like 5:1 to 5:17, and then there's 5:18 to 7:1 maybe, and then the last chapter, and they're all a big group. Each of those groups has their own groups of threes, right? So there's a group of three here. There's a group here, there's a group here, there's a group here for the whole sermon. Inside this one, there's also a group of three and a group of three and a group of three. And then inside this one here, there's another group of three, group of three, group of three. And it builds so that the very center of the entire sermon is the Lord's Prayer. If you're familiar with like Hebrew modes of thought, this is a chiasm. I'll write it up here. Where you've got point A, like argument A, and then you've got argument B and argument C, and then C1, B1, A1, right? And it kind of builds like a pyramid this way. When you do that, when you have the chiastic structure like this, where the first and last parts comment on each other and the second and the penultimate parts comment on each other, the thing that's in the dead center here is the most important thing. So scholars will argue, and they've done this for decades, as far as I know, that the text, the whole sermon should be read out from the Lord's Prayer, that it is the central teaching of the sermon, and that the other parts of the sermon should be read and interpreted in light of the Lord's Prayer. Good on this? I wanted to put this in front of you because we're going backward, obviously, but just so that we know where we're at while we're talking about it, okay? I went through just like I did with the other ones and kind of wrote big topics for us to cover, and we'll just get into it. Jesus goes up on the mountain. This is the clear indication that Matthew still wants you to be thinking in terms of Moses. That Matthew has Jesus ascending the mountain and giving a law in a way that Moses ascends the mountain and receives a law. He sits down, his disciples come to him. He begins to speak and teaches them. It's unclear if he's teaching just the disciples or the whole big crowd. Right? There's crowds with him, but he goes up a mountain and sits down, and then the disciples come to him. It doesn't say the crowds came to him. So it's unclear if he has like secluded himself and the disciples come looking for him and he teaches the disciples, or if he like climbs the side of the mountain so that everyone can see and hear him better. People will picture this very differently in their minds. It's unclear which way it goes. He begins to teach them, and he gives what we call the Beatitudes. We call it the Beatitudes because of the Vulgate. What is the Vulgate? Yes, so in like the 400s, Jerome takes the Bible and translates it into Latin, and it's kind of the authorized translation of the Bible for a long time in the Orthodox, in like the official church. In Latin, they translate this word that we translate as probably blessed, right? They translate it as beatus, which really just means happy, right? But there is so much debate about what this Greek word means. So the Greek word is makarios. We translate it. I'm curious if you all have different translations. Mine says blessed. I assume that's how most people translate it because that is the like traditional way to render it in English. I think some translations now will put happy, although that seems like such a thin word for us in English, like an unhelpful word. Like it doesn't really mean much. The book that I just showed you interprets it. I don't know if he actually would translate it this way for a Bible, but he interprets it as flourishing, as whole, as not that you are blessed in the sense of do these things and I will bless you. That's kind of how we interpret blessing. If you go out of your way to be poor in spirit, you will receive a reward. And that's not really what is happening here. It's much more in the line of like wisdom literature. If you think of the beginning of Proverbs, it's a father putting his arm around his son and saying, this is how you should live your life. And this is the good things that you should be doing. It seems much more that that's what we're getting at, is that you can experience wholeness and you can experience flourishing. The way that Pennington describes it, you can know what it truly means to be human in these situations. Good on this? So you are full, you are flourishing, but then look at all the ways that you can be full and flourishing. All of the terms described. They all appear kind of negative, right? If you're poor in spirit, if you're mourning, if you are meek, if you are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, I guess merciful is probably positive, pure in heart and peacemakers. But then look at 10. Those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And then verse 11, blessed are you, whole are you, you are complete, you're experiencing what it means to be human, when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. That's what it means to be human. That's what it means to be full and flourishing. It seems a little off, right? And so each one of these only really makes sense in light of the other half of each statement. How is it that you can be truly human when you're poor in spirit? It's because that position enables you to access the kingdom of heaven, right? When you are mourning, that is when you can be comforted. You don't really go and receive comfort when you're not in mourning. And on and on. When you're meek, what does meek mean in this instance, in this context? Humble, good. We tend to think of humble in our society now in a negative sense, in a sense of like to use like the colloquial term that, people will use on podcasts today. We normally interpret humble as like weak beta males, right? And us big, strong alpha men, we don't act that way, right? It's very prideful, but they do not have a high view of meekness or humility. To use an example that works for me, and I don't know if I've used this pop culture reference in this class or not. It's like, for me, it makes me always think of the Hulk from like the Avengers, right? The strongest person on the team is Bruce Banner. And Bruce Banner is the one who is always actively trying not to get in a fight. And the reason he doesn't want to fight is because he knows he will win. Meekness seems to be something along those lines of being humble in your power, having strength in your humility. Honestly, it's how Jesus is when he's on the scene, particularly in John. Jesus has this unlimited power, and he appears humble. Why is it that Jesus doesn't take up arms and overthrow Rome? It's because Jesus is the one who could do it. But it's not what he intends. It's not what he wants to do. He doesn't want to pick that fight because he knows he'll win. Good? The TLDR is, Dr. Langley thinks that the Hulk is Jesus or something. I don't know. Let's look at verse 9. I'm curious about this. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Some of you might have like sons of God. Has anybody seen this in pop culture in the last decade? Blessed are the peacemakers. Where do you all see it? What's that? Yes, that's where I see it. I see it on very over the top military guys who wear camo everywhere and hats with guns on them. And they get little patches that say, blessed are the peacemakers. And it's got a little gun on the picture that says, blessed are the peacemakers. Like, I assume the implication is, I'm going to inflict my violence on you to subdue you, and then we shall have peace once I am positioned on top of you. Or like in our global setting, America is imposing its violence and its military might on everyone else and forcing peace in the world. I assume that's what they mean. But it's so antithetical to the gospel that we're going to bring about peace through human violence, through the accumulation of power, through the display of power, right? I mean, it goes exactly against what we just talked about with meekness, right? So I see these on like guys' camo backpacks. I'm just like, that's not what it means at all. Like, it's so clearly the opposite of what Jesus is talking about. And yet it helps with this like military Christian ethos of I'm going to go and murder some people in the Middle East because God wants me to, or because it's going to help Christianity somehow spread. I mean, this is like Crusader stuff, right? It's so odd to me that it's like having this Crusader resurgence or whatever. I don't know. Does anybody have any thoughts on this? Maybe it's just me that, like, I always do a double take when I see one of them. Go ahead. Yes. So Aquinas is the one who develops the just war theory, that war can be just if it brings about peaceful ends, which I think some of us get on board with this. The idea of Bonhoeffer. It's better if we assassinate Hitler and stop him from killing millions of people in like the grand scheme of things. What I tend not to understand as much is the Christian encouragement of violence to achieve those ends. You know, as much as I might like the cost of discipleship with Bonhoeffer, I'm not on board with let's go and assassinate somebody to bring about peace. I just don't really get to that point. The Crusaders thought they were all doing the right thing. They all thought they were doing like God's work because they're getting rid of the barbarians and restoring the ability for Christians to come and like make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This is what we talked about in my history class yesterday. The conquistadors who come across into the New World and subjugate the natives, they all explicitly do this with the approval of the Pope in order to try to force conversion of like the barbarians in the New World. Because under their like mindset, it's better if I force you to convert so that you die and go to heaven rather than you live in your barbarism and die and go to hell. To the point where they would say, and I don't know how they get to this point, on like the back end of it, it gets to the point where they say, it's better if we Christians come and kill you than it is for you to exist apart from Christianity, which is what they end up doing. They end up, they do this in Spain in 1492. The reason that Columbus has the ability to go and like in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue is because Spain has finally expelled all of the Muslims and Jews. They had been fighting Muslims in Spain for 700 years. They finally get rid of all of them. And their like rule, the thing they come up with in 1492 is all of you Muslims and Jews have to leave the country, convert to Christianity, or we will kill you. And so they all leave because they're not going to convert and they don't want to be executed. But the idea of like the Christian monarchy with the support of the Pope is saying it's better if we execute you than for you to remain unconverted. So I can understand parts of it. Yes, it's better for the natives to hear about Christianity. Sure. It's better for them to die and go to heaven than it is for them to die and not go to heaven. But the point when you're inflicting violence to bring about the gospel, that's when I'm like, no, this is completely antithetical. This is exactly what you see at Gethsemane when Peter pulls out his sword and is trying to bring about violence. And Jesus stops the whole thing. And I think we've probably talked about violence already in this class. It is so odd to me that people can see something like, blessed are the peacemakers, and interpret it as, let's commit violence, which is the opposite of peacemaking, right? Good on this? We can move on. It's just, go ahead. Yes, for centuries, the church has understood itself as the minority, and the church has understood itself as persecuted at times in various ways. And the church has embraced martyrdom as a beneficial part of being a Christian, as something not to shy away from, right? And so I understand politically or militarily defending the innocent, sure. As Christians, though, our first impulse should not be to violently overthrow these things that are happening to us. Because Jesus doesn't do that, because Peter doesn't do that, because Paul doesn't do that, and centuries of early Christians don't do that. They embrace the idea that my death might actually bring about the gospel in ways that I don't understand. Jesus obviously understood it more than anyone, right? But like Stephen is martyred, and the church benefits from Stephen's martyrdom, right? And we see this on and on in Acts, and we see this in early church history, where Paul could have run away and hid. Paul could have tried to get some buddies together to fight and kill some guys on his way out, but he doesn't do that, because that for him is not the gospel. And so I understand that there's nuance, and I understand that there's political and geographical and protecting the innocent and all these sorts of things. But I dislike the current kind of mindset that's our first impulse should be violence, or our first impulse should be viewing yourself as a victim to the point of, oh, everybody's trying to oppress me and I'm so victimized, or whatever it is. This was kind of what we do in the States. We don't have like actual physical violent oppression over us, but we pretend like we do. Oh, they're taking away my rights because of this or this or this, right? I don't know that that's the mindset that Jesus and his disciples have, and I don't know that that's the mindset in the early church. But we can talk about this more later if we have time, but we got to keep moving forward because we've only made it through like 9 verses. I will point out in verse 11, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you. And then what's the word here? Well, no, utter all kinds of evil against you falsely. If you are evil, you are not included in this when people say evil about you. If people are accurately reporting how bad you are, this does not count, right? The idea is that you are a good person and people are lying about you. And so this idea of like you being a total jerk and then people calling you out on it, you say, oh, you're persecuting me because of this. And it's like, no, you're just being a jerk. And it's okay that people call you out on that, right? I hear this a lot. That's why I bring it up. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. In the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Okay. We get this whole thing about salt and light, which I think is like a mutually informing metaphor. We understand light and we understand salt and what they're supposed to do. We're supposed to behave this way, expressing the Beatitudes in a way that other people see and recognize, in a way that's winsome. Kind of what I just said about like not being a jerk about it. Okay. He says in 17, don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. This verse is very problematic in the rest of the New Testament and in the early church, because it seems contradictory to some other things that are written in other books of the Bible. It really does seem elsewhere that there are parts of the law that have been abolished. The only way that we can really categorize this is when he says fulfill, he means bring to an end, that he has accomplished them, to the point where like you as a believer don't have to worry about whether or not you can eat shellfish, right? It's not that he abolished the law. It's not that he said it doesn't matter. He said that it has now been fulfilled in me. And that's slightly different, and perhaps less hypocritical. My whole thing with our like Christian relation to the law is that anytime we talk about it, this is one of the big issues in Christianity. In Christian theology, Christians' relationship with the law is one of the big, main, huge issues. It's like the problem of evil and then Christian relationship with the law. They're big, huge problems. Our relationship with the law is a problem because on the outside, we almost always appear hypocritical. Okay, let's talk about hypocrisy for a second because Jesus talks about hypocrisy here in the sermon. Our word is hypocrisy, and it comes from a, let's see if I can pull up my slide in front of me because I've got the display here, but I don't have the notes so that I can write the right word for you because I cannot spell in Greek. The word in Greek is hypocrites. The origin of this word, anybody want to take a guess where this word comes from? This is the word used to describe somebody who gets on stage and acts. It's the Greek word for an actor. And what it means is you believe something in your heart, and the way that you act out loud is different than what's actually going on in your heart. That is the definition of what an actor is. And for them, they call actors hypocrites. And so we pick up on it, and other people pick up on this as well. Jesus isn't the one who's invented like using the term for this. But the point that Jesus makes is your actions should match your interior position. Now, Jesus means this in almost the opposite way that we normally mean this. We normally mean this as someone who like is a good church leader and has a good face for like the public, but is secretly doing bad things, right? We can all think of examples. You know, the mega church leader who gets arrested because he's with a prostitute, right? This is what we typically think of as hypocrites. Jesus means almost exactly the opposite. Jesus means your exterior, your actions are good, but your interior is dead. That what's going on inside is not devoted to the Lord the way that your exterior actions seem to be devoted to him. Go ahead. I think that's right. I think that's right. Jesus will condemn people because, so he calls the Pharisees like whitewashed tombs. You look good on the outside. The stuff that you're doing is right, but inside you're dead. And that is what Jesus is going to be critical of. He's going to say your actions, your ritual behavior is good. You're going to church and you're reading your Bible and you're serving on the worship team or whatever, but you don't actually have genuine heart transformation. And that's going to be what Jesus is critical of. What I'm talking about in addition to this is our view on the law is almost always viewed hypocritically by people on the outside because we condemn certain things or certain behaviors that are described in the law, but we allow others, right? We say you shouldn't commit adultery. You shouldn't have sex outside of marriage. You shouldn't have homosexual relations. But we don't care if you wear clothes of mixed fabric or eat shrimp or obey the Sabbath. I mean, a lot of us don't really care about the Sabbath, right? So from the outside, it seems like we just pick and choose. The way that it's articulated now is, well, really, you're just homophobic. Really, you're just sexually repressed. Really, you have these preconceived notions and you're picking and choosing biblical texts that support what you already think, and then you're throwing out the stuff that doesn't support what you already think. That's a very strong argument. And most people, most Christians that I know, do not have a response to it. What I'm saying here is maybe what Jesus is saying with this difference between abolishing and fulfilling can help us get a framework for navigating those sorts of texts, right? Maybe when Jesus is fulfilling the law, he's fulfilling the portions of the law that require us to separate ourselves from the rest of society, right? To categorize us as somebody different. The ethnic boundary identity markers that the Israelites had to practice. You don't eat shrimp because shrimp cross a boundary between water and land foods. Like they're kind of fish, but they're kind of not fish. They're kind of bugs, but they're not bugs. So we're not going to eat them because the Israelites are not supposed to interbreed with the Gentiles. And anything that crosses boundaries removes that symbolic separation between the Israelites and the Gentiles. And so Christians don't have to worry about this because Christians are not ethnically bound the way that the Jews were, the Israelites were. And so maybe those sorts of texts are fulfilled in Jesus because Jesus does perfectly obey them so that we don't have to. But then there are other texts that are more moral, or what we would call like universal rules, right? The 10 Commandments. Don't murder. Nobody is going around saying, well, now that Jesus is on the scene, we can murder. That's not really the way that anybody thinks about this. Okay. And this leads us kind of well into what we call the antitheses. This is what starts in verse 21. First of all, let's back up one verse. Verse 20. Your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Please do not view this as negative. When Jesus says this, the Pharisees are the most righteous people that you can think of. We always now have a very negative view of the Pharisees. When Jesus says this in the time, he's telling the crowd, think of the most righteous person you know and exceed them in righteousness. He's raising the bar very, very high. He's not saying, hey, think of the worst vile sinner in the world and do a little bit better than them and you'll be fine. That is not what he's saying. Okay. So he goes through and gives these 6 antitheses. I do not like the word antithesis. I don't think it's an accurate description of what's going on here because antithesis means the opposite. And at no point is Jesus giving you the opposite. He's not saying, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say, sleep with whoever you want. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say, if somebody bumps into you in the road, you should murder them. He does not give you the opposite of any of these claims. Of what he's doing, and I think we talked about this in an earlier instance. What he's doing is drawing a fence around the Torah, making it harder, making it raising the stakes. He is shifting the requirements of the law from exterior to interior. So he's saying, you do well not to murder people. Keep up with the no murdering. But also, if your heart is full of hatred and violence, that is just as bad as murdering. If your heart is not transformed, then it doesn't matter your exterior behaviors. This is the same thing with the talking about the hypocrites as actors. If you are not properly conforming your heart, then your exterior motivations don't really matter. Your exterior actions don't really matter. Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I think there's another instance in Matthew when Jesus says, you do well to tithe, and you tithe on your dill and your mint and your cumin. You should have not neglected those things and also dealt with the weightier matters of the Torah, justice and mercy, right? So he says the exterior things that you're doing are great, but they don't matter if the interior doesn't match, right? And what he's talking about there is specific. The dill and mint and cumin, that is a legitimate argument that Jewish leaders are having at the time about when it says you tithe 10%, what do you have to tithe? Do you just tithe the money your boss gives you? Or if you have a garden, an herb garden in your backyard, do you tithe 1/10 of the herbs that you collect? And the Pharisees are saying, yes, you tithe everything. If someone gives you $20 for your birthday, you should tithe on that. And the Pharisees are very strict in saying we should tithe on everything we receive because everything comes to us from God. And Jesus is saying, great, that's excellent. You should do that. But also justice and mercy. Jesus is consistently raising the bar. He is consistently elevating the requirements and making it harder and harder. So he's saying, yeah, you've heard don't murder. And honestly, I don't know that the translation is good, where all of them say, you've heard it said this, but I say to you this. I don't know that it should be, but I say to you this. Imagine if you read these and you saw, you've heard it said you shall not murder, and I say to you, don't hate. If it was said and instead of but, maybe we would get rid of this idea that it's antithetical, that it's the opposite. But instead give us the idea that it's adding on to the rules. Okay, let's keep moving forward. The other way that he is raising the bar at the end of these antitheses, verse 48, be perfect in the way that God is perfect. And again, this goes back to an issue of translation. The perfect here probably means whole or complete. The way that God is filled up in himself, the way that he is whole, the way that he is not lacking in anything, we should also experience that. And you experience that through human flourishing. You experience that through transformation of the heart, not through righteous acts done from a heart of stone. Good. He is continuing to raise the bar. And some people, I imagine, would hear this and say, well, shoot, I am kind of never going to measure up to this. You just said to be as righteous as the Pharisees, and I'm certainly not that. And now you're telling me to be perfect the way that God is perfect. I'm going to fall short. And I think Jesus says, perfect, come on in. It's the people who recognize that they need this that are going to benefit from it. Good? Yes. I think you're right, because it is very rhetorically structured. The argument is very well structured. So I think you're right that he is doing that intentionally. And there's debate about whether the sermon is written by Jesus or written by Matthew. Right? Jesus very well could have said all these things at different times in different places. And Matthew has compiled them into this magnum opus of this beautifully well-crafted sermon. Or it's also very possible that Jesus is the one who created and designed this beautifully well-crafted sermon. The question would then become, how is it that Matthew could accurately write down word for word this beautifully crafted sermon 50 years later? So there's debate that goes back and forth, and if you've seen The Chosen, there's people that use like the visual representation of, oh, Matthew is writing stuff down while it's happening. Who knows? There's debate about who it is that actually designs it, but there is no debate that it is well designed, that it is beautifully architectured in the way that it's presented. Let's keep moving forward. There's this curious thing in chapter 6. Don't practice your piety in front of others, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Whenever you do these things, people receive their rewards. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Then your Father who sees in secret will reward you. According to Jesus, why is it that we should do good things? Because you get a reward for it. This is very contrary to the way that we normally think about stuff. We normally think of like, no, I should do it because it's the right thing. I should do it because it's what God wants me to do. But Jesus repeatedly indicates, yeah, but there's also a personal motivation. You do good things, and if you don't brag about it, if you don't boast about it, if you don't get a human reward for it, God will give you a reward, right? To put it in like kind of crass terms, you'll get a bigger mansion when you get to heaven, right? Or something like that. You'll get a better seat in the throne room or something. We typically do not think in these terms, but it seems to be the way that Jesus is teaching here, that there is an aspect of your almsgiving or your piety or your prayer that is rewarded by God, and that reward can and maybe should be part of the reason you do it. I don't know how we jive with that, particularly in light of like our, works versus faith, construct that we have. I don't really know how we deal with that, but I put it out there because it's a little confusing. It's a little problematic. I like this in verse 7. When you're praying, do not heap up empty phrases like the Gentiles do. They think they'll be heard because of their many words. I mean, not to be mean, but I know folks that do this, that pray and they say the same words over and over and over, right? And it becomes kind of like a mantra. And Jesus is saying, no, you don't need to do that. In fact, God already knows what you're going to pray before you pray it. Which to me, as like a good, someone who believes in God's sovereignty and everything, I read that and my first like bad thought is, well, then I don't have to pray at all. What's the point of me praying? God already knows, he's already going to answer it. So I can just I can cut out the middleman, right? But Jesus doesn't get to that conclusion either. He doesn't say God already knows, so don't worry about it. You participating through prayer is part of the plan. Just because God knows that it's going to happen, knows what you're going to ask for, knows how he's going to respond, does not mean that you shouldn't pray. It just means that you don't have to go overboard. You don't have to stress about the words you're going to use. You don't have to think of like is it Elijah with the prophets of Baal, and he's kind of making fun of them. He's like, hey, come on, Baal might be sleeping. Let's try to wake him up. Maybe you need to scream louder. Maybe you need to bang on your drums better. And Jesus is saying, no, it's none of that. God isn't sleeping. God isn't distant. He already knows what's going on. You just need to come to him and talk to him, and he's got you. You don't have to work for this. Okay? Let's keep moving forward. At the end of the Lord's Prayer, if you forgive others their sins, their trespasses, your Father will forgive you. Does this seem like works to you all? If you do this thing, you'll be forgiven. This might be problematic. I assume most of us would write this off and say, no, it's not problematic. The only way that you can have a heart for giving other people is if you're already forgiven, or something along those lines, right? Of, oh, you're already transformed. You're already a loving, filled with the Holy Spirit kind of person. So now you can forgive others, and then God forgives you, and it's reciprocal. That's not really what the text says. The text says, you forgive other people and God will forgive you. If you don't forgive other people, he won't forgive you. I mean, that's the heavy implication, at least, right? So I don't know how we jive with this either. It's something we kind of have to wrestle with. Go ahead. He's got this whole section at the end of 6. Primarily interested in money. I think, and I haven't run the numbers myself, I've read this. Jesus talks about money more than he talks about anything. I wonder how reading the Gospels and being aware and intimate with the way Jesus talks about money, I wonder if it will shape the way we think about our economy, our kind of American, consumeristic, materialistic, capitalistic system that we have, particularly around Christmas, right? Jesus talks about money more than anything. Jesus talks about it so much. And most of the time when I hear people preach or teach on any of the things Jesus talks about, the sermon is almost always trying to make it less critical than it is. Right? So Jesus says, it's impossible for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's easier for a donkey to pass through the eye of a needle. Right? You're all familiar with this. Jesus says that to say it's impossible, period. It's not going to happen. And I have heard, I don't know how many sermons, and I don't know how many people teaching to say, well, there was a gate in Jerusalem, and it was called the Needle Gate. And camels coming up to the Needle Gate had to kind of kneel and crawl through the gate, but they could do it. It was just really tough. Has anybody heard people talk about this? It is complete fiction. There is no such thing. There is no needle gate. Camels can't crawl on their knees. It is not a thing at all. When people hear Jesus say it's impossible for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. No one is thinking, oh, it must be really hard. Everyone is thinking, I mean, let's be honest, for most of Jesus' audience, everybody's thinking, good thing I'm not rich, right? Right? Because it'd be worse for you to have more things, to have more money. All the time when I hear people teach about this, they always try to soften it. Oh, it's okay. You can have some money. Don't feel guilty about it. Jesus just means that you shouldn't cling to it. You shouldn't hoard your wealth. You should be generous. And that is never what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, birds don't build silos to store their food. Why should you? Birds don't have outfits. God clothes them. Or flowers don't have outfits. God clothes them. And they're very comfortable with it. They are more beautifully dressed than Solomon with all of his money that he spent. God will take care of you, and you don't need to worry about it. In fact, you cannot serve God if you are devoted to your finances. You can't do it. No one can serve two masters. Because you have to oblige yourself to one of them. I really am critical when I hear these sort of sermons of people trying to soften the teaching to make it less than what it is. I don't see that in the text at all. That Jesus is saying, oh, it's okay. You could store up wealth. And it doesn't really matter. Who cares if people get their SNAP benefits as long as the rich get richer? Good for them for their work ethic. It's very Christian of them to work so hard that they're making millions of dollars an hour. I don't see that in the text anywhere, right? That is not at all what Jesus is teaching. Now, some people will say like, well, Jesus' disciples and his teachings, they're very apocalyptic. They're assuming the world is going to end any minute, and it doesn't. So now we kind of need to adjust our mindset in a world where we don't think the end is going to happen tomorrow, and maybe we do need to save up some money. That's not in the text. So like maybe you could make that argument, but you can't make it from Matthew. You can't make it from the Gospels. You can't make it from Jesus. You got to go somewhere else to make that argument. Good? Okay. I'm sure all of us have heard Matthew 7:1. Do not judge so that you might not be judged. Right? I know a guy from high school who got a huge tattoo on his back, like across his whole back, and it says, "Only God can judge me." I'm like, yeah, but now that you got that big tattoo, like I'm judging you too. Like, if you read, the rest of the paragraph, that is not what the paragraph says. It does not say, don't judge. It says, if you are going to judge, you have to have proper interior motivations. The same thing he's been talking about for the rest of the sermon. Your interior motivation has to be correct in order to call out somebody else on doing right or wrong, right? It does not say you all have logs in your eyes, so you can't correct the specks in people's eyes. It says remove the log from your eye, then you can take out the speck from someone else's eye. It's very much, if you are in the right heart place, you can be critical. You can call people out for being hypocrites. But you can't do it if you yourself are a hypocrite. Good on this? Good. No one knows what verse 6 means. Do not give what is holy to dogs. Don't throw pearls before swine. Throw pearls before swine. Everybody's heard that before. Nobody knows what it means or why it's here in the sermon. Maybe it's like, don't waste your time. By judgment, he probably means like, if one of you is living in sin, and your friend comes along and calls you out and says you shouldn't be doing this. That's probably what they mean by judgment. And what maybe the connection here in verse 6 is like, well, if you're not a believer, then who cares if you're living in sin? Me coming and judging you would not be helpful at all. It'd be casting pearls before swine. But if you are a believer and you're living in sin, then I should call you out on it. The judgment is the pearls, which is the opposite of how we normally interpret judging people. It seems to be judgment is a good thing. Being critical or being evaluating of your friends and your family and your church members is a good thing, but only if you are in the right heart place and they are open to receiving it, if they are in the right place with God, if they are proclaiming Christ, if they're baptized, all these things. But if it's a random person on the street and they're wearing clothes that you don't think are appropriate, you judging them is hypocritical. It is wrong. It is casting pearls before swine, right? But if it's your, disciple that's in your small group and they're wearing clothes that you think is inappropriate, then you should go and talk to them about it. You shouldn't be wearing inappropriate clothes to go and confront them about their inappropriate. But you see what I'm saying? Removing your own hypocrisy puts you in a position where you can help other people conform to the image of Christ. Good on this? Good. The last thing here in the sermon, probably one of the more scary passages, in 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Many will say, didn't we prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many deeds of power in your name? And Jesus will say to them, I never knew you. Get away from me, evildoers. This is the consequence of hypocrisy. Claiming Christ, doing things in Christ's name, but having no relationship with him. And what's the consequence? Jesus has no relationship with you. Jesus does not defend you in front of the throne of his Father, right? Even though you have done good things in his name. The example he uses is good and bad fruit, where if a tree is producing bad fruit, you know it's a bad tree. And if a tree is producing good fruit, you know it's a good tree. But Jesus uses it in an opposite way to say, it needs to be that way. He says, if you're trying to produce good fruit, you have to have a good heart. You have to have good roots. Your fruit can't be good if you don't have a good root system, if you don't have a good heart place that you're coming from. It doesn't matter the good, righteous things that you do. They're not good, righteous things if you don't have a good, righteous heart. I think the example we've used in previous classes is like atheist, pagan, sinner, whatever, who is a firefighter who rescues babies from burning buildings. Great. It's a good thing. But morally, before God, it's sin. Because they're doing it for their own selfish ambition or for their own praise or for their own whatever. They're not doing it for the glory of God, and therefore it doesn't count. It doesn't merit them anything. Here, Jesus is also saying, you could do good things, but if you don't do them from the right position of heart, if you don't do them with a restored heart and with Christ as your intent, it doesn't matter. Good. And then he gets into this two paths. There are two roads. Where is the wide and narrow gate? 13. Enter through the narrow gate, and then the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life. And then there are two builders, a wise builder and a foolish builder. And if you build your life on anything other than Christ, eventually it will fall, because the rains will come and the waters will rise for everyone, sinner and Christian alike. The only people that will stand are Christians, are people who are genuinely built in the image of God, who are genuinely redeemed, who are transformed by the Holy Spirit, whatever terminology from Paul that we use for this. But the houses are going to look alike until the storms hit. The hypocrites and the non-hypocrites appear on the outside to be identical. And it's not until something happens that you realize who has really built their house on the rock. Good on this? Any questions on any of this? Go ahead. Yeah, and that reminds me of like I think it's James who says, you confess that God is one. Well, great, even the demons do that. Like the confession is not what's important. The casting out demons is not what's important. The miraculous healings are not what's important. What's important is the heart change. Even the intellectual assent that Jesus is God doesn't count, because every demon that Jesus interacts with during his lifetime knows that Jesus is God. But that does not put them in right relation with him. At some point, they talk about how every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. The implication there does not mean everybody's going to get saved. It's that everybody will confess, some of them joyfully and some of them reluctantly. Think of the difference when an emperor comes in. He's just, won this great war. He's taken over this new kingdom. When he comes in, everyone is bowing before him. His soldiers are bowing before him because they're super pumped about the emperor's here. The enemy combatants who might or might not about to be executed, they are also kneeling before him, but they are not nearly as pumped about it, right? This is the mindset that they have, the idea. So yeah, everybody is recognizing who Jesus is, but the difference is, do you do it reluctantly or not? Do you do it out of a transformed heart from the Holy Spirit, right? Jesus is going to say, God is the one who's revealing this to you. God is the one who's choosing you. God is the one who's redeeming you and teaching you these things. And you really wouldn't be on board. You wouldn't be one of my disciples if God hadn't been the one to pull you in and reveal to you who I really am. That's the benefit. And because you're in this position now, when you build your house, it will stand.